Welcome to the All for Literacy podcast, hosted by Dr. Liz Brooke, welcoming established and emerging voices in literacy education and the science of reading. Explore with us the connections between literacy research, educators' knowledge and skills, and the implementation into classroom instruction.
I know we're making progress, but I don't know, is it good enough? Is this sufficient progress?
You've just heard Margaret Goldberg, literacy coach and co-founder of Right to Read. Today, Margaret joins Dr. Liz Brooke in a conversation about literacy advocacy and the pursuit of equity through literacy. Here's your host, Dr. Liz Brooke.
The idea that the science of reading is not just about phonics. We have Scarborough's rope and we have the simple view, and people always forget the language comprehension aspect, whether it's the rope or the simple view. And I think, we know from research that oral language is the foundation for later written language. And to your point, Margaret, that most schools don't understand how the importance of language and then what to do about it in the schools and in the classrooms.
Yeah, and so for my school, which I think is 67% English learners, one of the things that has come up for us a lot is we're learning about language, we're learning about how to teach it explicitly and systematically, we're learning about how to listen to our students to understand where they are in their language progression. But what happens if we start having some concerns about students where we're like, so Spanish is their home language. We're not noticing the response to the English instruction is the same as what we're noticing from some other students. How do we sift through this in order to be able to understand if the child is at risk or not, and what should we be doing? And there were so many basic things that we learned in the training with Tiffany and with her team, talking about how, well, you need to find out, how did their language develop in Spanish? Were they meeting developmental milestones? Are they more fluent in one language than the other? All of those questions. And what we were realizing is that the teacher perspective often is there's a silent phase or a quiet phase as they're learning English. And so we're comfortable with that extending for years. But the truth is there's a huge number of students who come into school in kindergarten, and they have from kindergarten to 12th grade, and we don't teach them English well enough for them to be able to be reclassified as English proficient. And we look at that is the failure of the school system. And it's also a failure of our understanding of at what point should we have been concerned, and at what point should we have been amping up the dosage of language instruction, making it more systematic, making it more explicit, and ensuring that students were making the gains that they needed to all along the way. Does that break your heart, Elsa, as you hear it?
That really is. Well, but it does happen. But what we know is, as I said, when you're looking at these things, we're looking across languages. I mean, it has come to my attention, even here's twins, and we've brought these case studies to them to show them, look, this one twin, same family, isn't progressing along, and sometimes the response is, well, give them more time. Right. And I go, that's their peer, right? And so you're right, Margaret. We have to look at the context. How much, did they have schooling, prior schooling? Was that schooling in their home language? Was it in the second language? And how are they progressing along? But what's the context also, Margaret? Is the context that they're doing dual language, two languages at once? Or is it that they're learning English as an additional language and primarily in English only? And do our instructors understand how to capitalize upon what they do know? And so we can do some things even in language that can be very purposeful and authentic and helpful. But we have to give the opportunities. Anita Archer always talks about the practice. How much practice are we getting? And I have the same concerns about reading, Margaret. How much reading practice are they getting in the schools? How much language practice? And as speech language pathologists, when children come and see us, we already know the targets, and we already have in our minds, and plans for we're going to get to those language targets. We understand about language development. We have to understand about second language development. And then we have to understand that there has to be progression, but how can we target the skills that they need in language, which I say that multi-language foundation is the support for that multi-literacy.
Yes. So many great nuggets there that, as I was telling Anita yesterday, one of the first times I saw her talk, she talked about the gradual release model and the practice. And so she was saying, I do, we do, we do, we do, we do, you do, right? And that idea of practice. And one of the things she's often reminding, every time I hear her, I learn something new. And the piece about the teacher talk versus the student talk, and what is the percentage of time. And I think in emergent bilingual, some of the literature, but you tell me, it's almost the students were given about 5 minutes out of a full hour, or maybe even less, to actually be talking and practicing their language. And then again, something that Sharon mentioned yesterday about actually getting to read the texts, and not just practicing isolation or single skills. And even the question about decodable text versus authentic text, which how do we get students practicing both the language as well as the literacy? And so as you've been working with Tiffany, what are some of the ways that you're realizing as a teacher that you can not only focus on the language but get that practice and that experience?
So it used to be, my school had adopted what was considered high quality instructional materials, the HQIM. Okay. And it used to be that what happened is our primary grade teachers would ask the questions that were written into the lesson plans. And there were periods of time where the students would turn and talk, and you'd listen and you're like, they're not actually really answering the question. And actually that question was really hard. And like, sometimes I'm not actually sure how to answer that question. You're like, I get that the goal of the program that we had was standards aligned instruction. And when you look at it, you're like, oh, every lesson was trying to target specific standards with the questions that we were to ask students. And then when we switched and we started using researcher-developed curriculum, materials that were made during the Reading for Understanding grant, what we started to realize is, oh, those lesson plans, they're much more routine. They're much more reliable. It is an I do, a we do, a you do with a hook and a close every time. They have predictable lesson types. So when kids are hearing a story read out loud to them, the experience is very similar. We are having very limited worksheets. So instead of like, you got this activity and you need to explain to them what to do, and then the next day you're giving them a different worksheet that has different directions and you're explaining to them what to do, where you're wasting a lot of time and language explaining to kids what's expected, instead of the routinized instruction where we're using word webs and we're talking about how words relate to each other and we're using the same graphic organizer every time, but the words that were coming in or out of that graphic organizer are different.
So their cognitive load can focus on the new words,
yes,
not on the instructional routine.
Instead of having to figure out what is my teacher telling me to do, instead they can say, oh, I know how to do this. This is the way that I participate. And so what ends up happening is the focus is less on the teacher move. Even the teachers are less focused on what's the thing I'm supposed to do next, and more of the focus is on the language that students are generating in response to those prompts.
I love that, because you're talking about the teacher also realizing, oh, this is a routine. I'm really good at this now. But the same thing for the student. And when you're talking about a multilingual student, right? What we see there, those routines are essential to know and you're taking away the different language demands. You're giving them the practice that they need, and you're giving them evidence-based strategies that they can use and generalize.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we loved learning about is what corrective feedback do you give if a student gives you something that's not your target response. And so for us to learn some pretty basic strategies that I had never heard of before, like, for example, if students not generating what you were expecting, to be able to say, like, to offer a closed sentence and have them fill in the blank, or to give them closed options. Is it this one or is it this one? To give them the answer and see if they're able to repeat it back to you and then ask the question again. Like, all of those really basic teaching tools were not in our toolbox, and they're not in most commercially available programs. And so I think what has been so helpful to me is to realize, like, years ago when I read, there's a chart Louisa Moats had done, I think it was in Whole Language Lives On, and it's what are the practices that are scientifically based and what are the practices that are rooted in whole language. And I was reading that chart and I was like, on phonics, check, on text, check, on all of those things, on foundational skills. And I'm like, but she says we're supposed to be teaching grammar systematically and explicitly. Like, oh, we're supposed to be teaching all of the language comprehension side. I've never seen what those lessons look like until recently. And I think that is a testament to how big the research to practice divide has been, that we've been calling for this for a while and only now getting to that point.
Absolutely. And you're saying that all those resources that Tiffany Hogan and her lab have been sharing with your school were all done through those research grants that Read for Understanding.
Yes, and just to get a little bit more specific, I think one of the things that she and I were talking about this past week, because I was trying to understand the cuts to NIH, and I was trying to figure out, like, what are these indirect costs that are needing to be limited to 15%? And then as she started explaining it to me, I realized all of the work that we have been doing was an indirect cost. So her time spent with me was in the hopes of being able to create something that we could then submit as a grant, which we have done. We've submitted to NIH now. But when I think about the fact that she had that flexibility to be able to say, there's a school that's reaching out and they want my help and they're interested in learning how to do these things, and I have the materials that they need, and I have the person power that I can devote some doctoral students to their project in order to be able to create something that could grow and become something that's scalable for other schools. She was able to do that with the flexibility of funds that have now been cut.
Yes. Yes, and the on grants, and I don't know if you want to give us a few more sentences around that. You mentioned direct and indirect costs, and can you just tell us a little bit
more?
Those
indirect costs, go to the universities that are supporting the work. But you're right, she was able to do that work through some of this indirect cost, right? Especially as the grant is over, right? And now the work continues, and the need continues. Yeah. The need continues, and we have right now a model demonstration for dyslexia, which is all about practice, what's going on in the schools, and it's funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. So really looking at children, you talk about, Margaret, the children, like who's at risk, and which percentage of children at risk, that we're all going to find students at risk. Some will say, it'll be, 10%, or some will say 5 to 10%, some will say up to 17%, and, just depending how they look at the definition of what this means. But students at risk will also need this help. And what's so beautiful is when we find the risk from these tools that were developed through the research grants that states are now using and local districts are using, then what that means is we caught it early. And what happens to the students because of that early opportunity and intervention, they succeed, right? And then it's not so costly, right? Special education programs are costly, but when you get that early intervention, then the costs go down because the students succeed early. And we can prevent a lot of future problems through these early screening tools, through this early interventions, and all through the research that has been done that we're all using in our schools across our country.
Absolutely. When I was down at FCRR, I was the director of intervention, and people would always say, what is the best intervention? And I would always say prevention, right? To catch them early. Or they'd say, what's the best tier 2 or tier 3 program? Or what do I do? What do I use if, 40% of my students are in tier 2 and tier 3? I said, well, let's go back and look at your tier 1. I think a lot of people think research is often only about special education, right? And we know that is not true. And, again, it's similar to the concept that, emergent bilinguals weren't included in research, or that research was only done in special education, not in general education. And so we just want to make sure the listeners, as you're thinking about research, it is across the tiers, if you will. So the core instruction or special education, it is not just focused on phonics or focused on dyslexia. It does include that really important piece of the language piece. And I think, you've talked about some of the new techniques that you're learning, some of the assessments. I think language, when we think about letter sound correspondence, although there are oftentimes many sounds and letter combinations that don't, everybody's like, oh, our language is so crazy, it doesn't follow rules. There's actually a lot of rules and a lot of consistency, but language, there's so much rich language and so many layers of language. The relationships, you talked about the webs that you're creating, and so there's so much there with the rich language. But just, again, coming back to the idea of this research is across the board. And now even thinking about there's the science of reading, and you talked about we're now focusing more on the how,
Yes.
right? This implementation science.
So that came to mind when you were talking about the misconceptions that we may have about the research, like that it was done in a clinic, in a like one-on-one intervention that's not replicable in the classroom. And while it is true, a lot of work was done in those environments. The work that I'm most interested in, and the work that Tiffany and I have been talking about a lot, is implementation science. And so one of the things that has been fascinating to me is that when I explained to her what's going on in my school, I work in a high poverty urban school that has a whole lot of the consequences of being part of a larger dysfunctional system. And so when I'm explaining to her about some of the things that we're struggling with, she has never done what I've heard from some other researchers. She's never done the like, oh, well, that's just really frustrating. Or like, oh, I don't know. It's always been, okay, so there are barriers. Let's identify what types of barriers those are. Let's think about what facilitators you have. Let's figure out how to try to help you work around those barriers. What are the resources that we're working with? And one of the things that I found really comforting is that she takes our context seriously and is willing to work with us within that context. And that's what's going to make it possible for us to figure out, how do we scale this? And I think one of the things that we all need to be humble about is we've never scaled well. Like, there was a huge amount of money that has been invested. I was talking with Jane Ashby at one point, and she's like, well, the good news is that the first $1 billion has already been invested. And so now we can work more towards that last mile of making sure that effective practices are spreading in all of the various contexts that we have in the country. And so when I think about the science of reading, I think about the research that's yet to be done, and I think about the research that's yet to be applied, and applied broadly in a variety of different contexts.
Absolutely. And Tiffany has been teaching me a lot about this, and you mentioned Nicole Patton-Terry, Adria Truckenmiller, and there's the RISE Center out of University of Washington, and Dr. Erin Lyons, around implementation science and this idea of it's about finding the barriers and about identifying, they call it the know-do gap, right? Of what we know and what we're actually doing in schools. And so that, to me, when people say, well, what's next? We've done, quote unquote, we've done the science of reading, right? You've learned about some of this evidence. Now we have to focus on how do we scale. To your point, it's not something we've been successful about, unfortunately not successful. And then the other thing we mentioned earlier is when a superintendent or principal leaves and they then take the knowledge with them, and we don't have those systems and structures to sustain it, not only scaling it, but sustain it at a building or a district. So that implementation science is something that is so important.
And we need to get the practices in place. We need to be clear as we're starting the work, clear in what we collaboratively know to do, but as situations come up, we need, what's called that, to be flexible in making those adjustments and learning from those adjustments that we need to make as we go along. And how do we keep it? And it really involves a whole system. Yes. And that's why the school leadership, the district leadership, and the teachers themselves, but also the families. Yes. Our work with families and engaging our families has been so valuable, because this talk about practice. Yeah. Outside of the school day, how much practice can we get in language and in reading for understanding? Very, very important. So we can't forget our families, and we need to do a lot of work with our families and communities as partners in this work.
You were talking earlier about the bidirectionality, and I think about that when it comes to like a model that has not worked has been, I'm going to, as a researcher, do some studies, I will present them and I'll put them into a peer-reviewed journal, and then it's out there. And the truth is, teachers don't have access to peer-reviewed journals. We don't have the email addresses that will get us beyond the paywall. That's not a way to reach us. So when Elsa's talking about coming to the conferences where the teachers are and sharing the information, and then coming to the schools where we are and collecting information about what is and what isn't working in order to develop the next questions for research. Absolutely. And I think that bidirectionality, the being where the teachers are in order to be able to hear from us what we need in order to be able to overcome our barriers, is one of the pieces that's been missing.
Absolutely. And so as we think about, again, some of the happenings, making sure people understand that these research grants are still so needed, not only to continue learning what's working, but this other piece around the implementation science. Again, the center I mentioned at University of Washington, I believe that is a federally funded center, and others around the country. It's just really, really important. And so as we start to wrap up, I do want to come back to one thing you said, because Sharon Vaughn mentioned it as well, the 95% number. And I kept hearing that as well. And so I wanted to find out, where is that coming from? So one thing that I've discovered or shifted how I talk about that number is that the NIH and the World Health Organization estimate about 2 to 5% of students have cognitive challenges, that such severe cognitive challenges that they most likely will not become skilled and fluent readers. And I think that number, so that 95% have the capacity to learn to read when taught using the science of reading. And I think I've started to use it because it can become discouraging, or it can become, it feels unattainable, right, in a lot of cases, and especially if you're starting at the 33%. And again, the idea that I'll get to that 95% and I'll get there next year, right? There's a great book out of Kennewick, Washington, by Lynn Fielding and colleagues that Joe Torgerson gave us. We called it the Green Book, but it's called Annual Growth for All, Catch-Up Growth for Those Who Are Behind. And it was this district that focused solely on reading, and that was their goal, to get 95% of their third graders reading at grade level. It took them 11 years, right? So anyway, I just wanted to come back to this number of 95%. And again, where I think that number came from, or might have come from, is this idea that 2 to 5%. So if we said, if we took the high range of that, the 5%, we could say 95% have the capacity.
But I like that you said, even in that 2 to 5%,
Right.
what we need to be looking at, sometimes they were called non-responders. No, they're responding, but it's at a much slower rate, right? So we can't give up,
Right, yes,
the
no,
hope, but
not to give up
but
on
yes,
this 2 to
the
5%.
the 95% should be able to. This small percentage will need some really intense work, and it'll be, slow, gradual.
Yes.
Not as fast as the other children in your classroom.
Yeah. Well, when I look at, we're talking percentages, I was just at my school doing a data dive, and we were looking at the students who are now in 4th grade that started with us in 1st grade and have been with us through this whole plan of rolling out evidence-based instruction. And when they started in 1st grade, 91% of them were in need of intensive intervention, according to Dibbles. And we were able to use commercially available curriculum, assessments, some basic knowledge that was freely available to us. We've been able, for that cohort of students, to cut down the need of intensive intervention to 16% now. And when I look at that, I feel enormously proud. And then I also think about the fact that not all of them are going to score as proficient on our state tests, because they are limited, many of them, in their language comprehension. And our next step, our continuing next step, is to figure out how to raise the ceiling for their reading as high as possible, as quickly as possible, so that all of our kids can learn to read.
Very good. Congrats.
But that's why there needs to be
Amazing.
more research, and this is why we need our partnership. And this is why it's so important to me to be able to talk about the work that has not yet been done yet, so that we're able to focus on going that last mile.
Absolutely. And yes, congratulations. That's amazing. But you said, how long have you been?
This is the midway through our 4th year.
Yes. And so that it is hard work, but it's work that we know will work. But we know that there's always different factors in different schools, and so that research needs to continue, whether in implementation science or continuing in the reading components. And so as we always conclude on our episodes, just thinking about all the things we've talked about today, some really exciting things, some things that are causing some concern, and we're hopeful that the research will not go away. The funding will continue. We won't take away the resources that have been established. We've talked about a lot today around the importance of language, and the emergent bilinguals and multilingual students are not separate from the science of reading. They were included. This is appropriate, but they need some modifications in terms of, or additional focus in terms of their language and thinking about their home language. So if I could ask each of you, what makes you most hopeful for the future in literacy in our country? And again, what is maybe one thing you hope for in relation to all of the things we talked about today?
What I'm so excited about is the work done in schools and the partnerships and the collaborations like Margaret has described. And what I really, want to say is it wouldn't have been possible without, the funding and the research. And I look forward to our continued work on the implementation science, how we get this scaled up across our country, because we have lots of places, many places across our states and regions that have done fantastic work. And when you look at the report card, it's like, how are we all doing? Right. And I think about the pandemic and those children that are now in 4th grade, right? And so we've got to make sure that there weren't any missing gaps. But I'm excited about the implementation science and the work that we're doing, the positive outcomes we're getting.
Absolutely. And you say about NAEP scores with 4th and 8th graders. These 4th graders were basically in kindergarten, just starting their journey when the pandemic hit. Those 8th graders were just starting that transition of reading to learn, thinking about learning to read and reading to learn. So what a tremendous time that the pandemic hit in their learning. But I love that. And yes, that partnership, that implementation science. And how about you, Margaret? What is giving you the most hope?
Well, one of the things that I learned, and I have not double-checked my fact on this, but I heard from someone that at the Plain Talk conference where we are right now, 70% of the attendees are new. And I think whether or not that number is 100% reliable, the fact is there is a growing interest among practitioners of wanting to learn about research and wanting to learn about evidence-based practices and how to best serve our students. And so when I think about this groundswell that's happening, where there's more and more demand for information and for tools that will really work because we want to be able to ensure that all of our students learn how to read, that makes me incredibly hopeful. And one of the things that guides my work at my school is to see the amount of enthusiasm we have when we start noticing things that are working for our students. It creates this swell of pride and excitement to come back to school the next day. And teaching is hard. We need all of the fuel that we can possibly get by feeling like we're in a positive cycle of learning and then getting better outcomes from our kids, getting more questions, and then learning more. And so what I'm hoping will end up happening is that we've created enough teacher consumer demand for the research, enough teacher consumer demand for high quality professional development and ongoing research, and hopefully more research to practice partnerships that focus on implementation so we can get it done right in a variety of different contexts and then learn how to scale from there.
Absolutely. And when you said about 70%, it's of 3,000 educators, we said, right, that are here. So that is an amazing statistic that they're hungry for this information. And it is, teaching is hard work. And so we need to continue to support our educators. And we do that with the research, with hopefully podcasts like this can be helpful. I know we have coming up in the beginning of March, we have a Science of Reading Week. With many of these people we've been talking about, Adria Treckenmiller and Dr. Erin Lyon, talking about whether it's district leaders or school leaders or teachers, we need to get this information out to them in ways that are accessible because, as you said, right, belonging to all these journals, a lot of teachers they do the Google search and they want to look at the research, but then it's behind the paywalls. And so how do we get that information out there? How do we continue the conversation? So I can't thank you both enough for taking your time today. Such an important topic. And I love the idea of this research and practitioner partnership being bi-directional. And we've heard that from a lot of our guests, that teachers are learning from the researchers, but and you said this many times, Elsa, that the researchers learn so much by being in the classrooms and from these experts who are the teachers.
And we learn from the children too.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.